The South African school system has lied about who was responsible for ending apartheid and how it ended. Here's the truth. So for those of us who've been through the South African schooling system, it's become apparent that the way that history is taught, specifically South African history, is often distorted, particularly when it comes to apartheid. While, of course, certain verifiable facts are shared, unfortunately, the history classes that we go through in school oftentimes overlook large portions of history that ultimately distorts the bigger picture. In this video, I'm going to reveal exactly where the history syllabus has gone wrong and who actually is to thank for ending apartheid. But before we get into this video, could I please remind you to subscribe to the channel? It's entirely free, and all you have to do is click on the subscribe button below the video. Furthermore, for additional benefits, consider becoming a member of the channel. You can become a Power Club member by clicking the join button below. Now let's begin. So when I was in school, I remember learning about apartheid, particularly in high school, and being taught how the ANC and Nelson Mandela were really the liberators of South Africa. I remember hearing stories about how heroic Mandela and his fellow freedom fighters were, how they continued to apply internal pressure to the South African government, and how eventually the South African government decided to capitulate and bring an end to apartheid. While we did hear a little bit about the international pressure as well, this was often placed in the background, and a lot more emphasis was put on Mandela, the ANC, and of course the armed wing of the ANC, Khonto Sizwe. The problem, however, is that this overlooks the reality in the country. Now, before I jump into this video, I understand that this is a sensitive topic for many viewers. And I do say that, of course, yes, it is important for us to take note of the sacrifices made by the likes of Mandela and other anti-apartheid activists. Whether we're talking about the likes of Steve Biko and Chris Hani, who lost their lives in the struggle, staunch ANC members such as Walter Sisulu and Oliver Tambo, or even minorities, non-black South Africans who contributed to the struggle, such as the politician Helen Suzman, or the lawyer George Bizos, who actually used their professions to fight against apartheid. It is indeed important that we give these people the acknowledgement and respect that they deserve, and we honor their sacrifices. Still, we cannot allow respect and honoring sacrifices and actually political correctness to shroud the entire truth. So here it is. Let's discuss the actual truth about who ended apartheid, because at the end of the day, we cannot allow our feelings to deter from the facts. So there are two important angles we need to take a look at when discussing the struggle against apartheid. The first angle is the external angle, namely the international pressure that was placed on South Africa. The second angle is the internal fight. But I'd like for us to start with the external lens. So in front of us, we have this important article from the Office of the Historian. But I'd like for us to specifically take a look at this paragraph right here. So in this article, it explains that the international community had begun to take notice of the brutality of the apartheid regime after white South African police opened fire on unarmed black protesters in the township of Sharpeville in 1960, killing 69 people and wounding 186 others. So, of course, we know that this was the Sharpeville massacre. It was a defining moment in the apartheid struggle. And, of course, this is really where the world started to zone in on what was going on in South Africa. Because before, from 1948, when apartheid was introduced until this moment, there wasn't really much of an emphasis on South Africa and its importance on the world stage. So the United Nations led the call for sanctions against the South African government, fearful of losing friends in Africa as decolonization transformed the continent, Powerful members of the Security Council, including Great Britain, France, and the United States, succeeded in watering down the proposals. Now, we understand that for the US, South Africa was a very complicated place because, of course, while the US, to a large extent, was against apartheid morally, they did have an alliance with the South African government because, after all, South Africa were against communism and the threat of the USSR. And we need to understand that at this point in time, up until the 90s, the Cold War was raging, whereby the US and the USSR were at odds. So we need to understand that, yes, the United States did indeed collaborate with South Africa, but that doesn't mean that they liked apartheid morally. They did it in order to serve their self-interests, as pretty much any country does. Moving on, we see how by the late 1970s, grassroots movements in Europe and the United States succeeded in pressuring their governments into imposing economic and cultural sanctions on Pretoria. After the US Congress passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in 1986, many large multinational companies withdrew from South Africa. By the late 1980s, the South African economy was struggling with the effects of the internal and external boycotts, as well as the burden of its military commitment in occupying Namibia. So we are going to speak about the military activities of the South African Defence Forces a little later in the video, but for now, I'd like for us to remain focused on the international pressure, and let's start by taking a look at the all-important Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act of the United States. So on this page, we have an official copy of the Act itself from the US Congress website. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire Act because it is quite detailed, but I will include a link to the Act in the description box below so you can check it out for yourself. But in order to summarize what it speaks about, this US law was aimed at imposing significant economic sanctions against South Africa, and it was really done in order to pressure the government to dismantle apartheid. So, for example, new investments in the South African economy were banned for US companies, and then also we saw how trade was curbed. So, for example, coal, iron, uranium, and agricultural product exports were effectively banned. So all of a sudden, the South African government had a much harder time doing business with the US, which was a critical trade partner. We also saw how air links were cut, so to make travel a little bit more difficult for the South Africans. And we also saw how aid to victims of apartheid was actually also being provided. So ultimately, this US Act was a major step forward in fighting the anti-apartheid struggle. But beyond that, we also saw how the United States and the United Nations together decided to take the fight one step further. The monumental step I'm speaking about is Resolution 418 of the United Nations Security Council. So in 1977, the Security Council decided to condemn the government of South Africa for its widespread violence and the killing of African civilians, including school children, students, and others opposing racial discrimination, and which called upon the government to urgently halt such violence and take immediate steps to dismantle apartheid and racial segregation. Now, I am going to provide a link to this piece as well in the description box so you can check out the full entire article. But what's important to understand about this act is that it was effectively an arms embargo. So at the time, the South African military was heavily involved not only in internal conflicts and fights against Umkhonto we Sizwe, but external as well, specifically the border war, which involved Namibia, Zambia, and Angola. And so by taking this step, the UN was able to place a lot of military pressure on South Africa and really throttle their access to resources. Whereas, of course, the United States had been leading the pressure on the trade front. So if we take a look here at who actually supported this act, we see that the entire Security Council voted unanimously in favor. Now, if we take a look at the Security Council composition here, we see that only the abbreviations of each country is given. So I'll just read them out to you in full. So at the time, the permanent members of the Security Council who voted were China, France, the Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and the United States. So this is very interesting because we see how the UK, the US, and France, as leaders of the West, were supporting this anti-apartheid action. Of course, China and the Soviet Union were also in support. So it shows you how Western powers were also putting on the pressure, not just the people who the South African school system wants us to believe were South Africa's allies, such as China and Russia. We also saw a range of non-permanent members who also supported this act. This includes Benin, Canada, another Western ally, India, Libya, Mauritius, Pakistan, Panama, Romania, Venezuela, and West Germany, which of course was American aligned. So we've spoken quite extensively about the international pressure on South Africa. But now it's time for us to look at the second important aspect, which is the internal strife. And the easiest way for us to take a look at this is to look at the timeline of Umkhonto we Sizwe's activities, as well as the actions of the apartheid government and their military. So here we have a timeline of Umkhonto we Sizwe's actions since its establishment. Now, of course, this is a very extensive timeline, and so I've highlighted a couple of important events for us to take a look at. So from the beginning, we see how on the 16th of December 1961, Umkhonto we Sizwe was formed by the ANC, the South African Communist Party, and other fraternal organizations. And this was announced with a series of bomb blasts against apartheid structures in Johannesburg, Port Elizabeth, and Durban. Now, in 1962, we saw how Nelson Mandela left South Africa for military training. By March, he was receiving training from the Algerian National Liberation Front at bases of the latter across the border in Morocco. By 1963 and 1964, we saw how the South African police were already on MK's case. On the 20th of March, police obtained information that Sisulu is an office bearer of Umkhonto we Sizwe. And then the Rivonia trial happened, which resulted in a range of high commanders of the MK being arrested. These included Nelson Mandela himself, Govan Mbeki, Walter Sisulu, Dennis Goldberg, Ahmed Kathrada, Raymond Mhlaba, Andrew Mlangeni, and Elias Motsoaledi, and they were charged to life imprisonment and, of course, were sent to Robben Island. So, moving on to 1967, from the 30th of July to the 3rd of August, the Lutuli detachment occurred, whereby the ANC and Zimbabwe African People's Union guerrillas crossed the Zambezi River into southern Rhodesia, the present Zimbabwe, and engaged joint Rhodesian and South African troops at the start of the Wankie and Sopolio battles, which raged until late 1968. In 1971, on the 11th of November, we saw how Angola gained independence from Portugal. The Angolan government decided to invite MK members to train its cadres on Angolan soil. So at this stage, we saw how not only were MK active in Angola, but also Mozambique. On the 16th of June, of course, we saw the Soweto uprisings. So in addition to the deaths that occurred on that tragic day, we also saw how thousands of youth left South Africa to join MK. They are henceforth called the June 16th Detachment. And then from 1976 to 1978, there is a dramatic increase in MK operations, including the sabotage of railway lines, attacks on police stations, and so on. And so at this moment in time, we see how the MK and the South African army were not in an all-out war in the way that the South African Defence Forces were in the border war. We see that at this moment in time, the operations were really just small guerrilla attacks by the MK against different important installations of the apartheid government. Moving on, in 1980, on the 25th of January, we saw the Silverton siege take place. So MK combatants are intercepted en route to a mission and take refuge in a bank in Silverton, Pretoria. The MK combatants explain the policies of the ANC to the hostages, pledge not to hurt them, and demand Nelson Mandela's release. There was actually a Netflix movie made about this. So the police bundled the operation and killed some of the hostages as well as the 3 MK comrades, but several policemen also succumbed to their injuries. On the 30th of January 1981, we saw how the South African army raids Matola in Maputo, Mozambique, and assassinates 12 ANC members. General Constant Viljoen, chief of the SADF, announces that earlier in the day, a South African commando has attacked and destroyed the planning and control headquarters of the ANC at Matola in Maputo, Mozambique. And according to the SADF, 30 ANC activists were killed and 2 SADF recruits died. On the 22nd of February, the Soviet Union supported Mozambique after the South African raid on Matola by sending 2 warships to Maputo. At this stage, we're already seeing how the border war is overlapping with South Africa's fight against Umkhonto we Sizwe. On the 6th of April, the heads of state of Botswana, Lesotho, Mozambique, and Swaziland met in Mbabane to discuss South African military incursions and subversive activities against black Southern African states. Moving on to the 14th of March 1982, we see how a bomb wrecks the ANC offices in Islington, London, shortly before the beginning of a mass rally organized by the anti-apartheid movement. So, of course, the ANC had a presence in Europe as well. A powerful bomb at 2:05 a.m. destroys the cells behind the Langa Commissioner's Court in Cape Town, where thousands of past law offenders have been sentenced. The blast causes widespread damage to the office, which houses personnel files on Africans in the Western Cape. The blast was part of ANC campaign aimed at creating confusion in the apartheid administration by destroying records of blacks, and took place on the eve of the anniversary of the Sharpeville massacre. No one was injured. Moving on to the 4th of June, the ANC chief representative in Swaziland, Petrus Nzima Nwayose, and his wife are killed in a car bomb explosion. And so yet again, we see how there are these sort of espionage, spy-like attacks that have happened, both carried out by the MK as well as the apartheid government, such as these bombs that have happened and these targeted assassinations. So still we see this pattern of very covert operations occurring. And of course, there were a lot of casualties and civilians got harmed as well. But ultimately, it wasn't an open, all-out war. On the 9th of December, we saw the South African forces raid houses in Maseru, killing 30 members of the ANC and 7 women and children who were caught in the crossfire. A chain of sabotage incidents within South Africa are blamed on the ANC command structure in Lesotho. The incursion is widely condemned. Moving on to the 20th of May 1983, we saw how a car bomb exploded outside the South African Air Force headquarters and the South African Defence Force Military Intelligence headquarters in Pretoria, killing several civilians. MK claimed responsibility. In retaliation for the Pretoria car bomb, the South African Air Force launched a raid on 6 ANC targets in the suburbs of Maputo. South African Air Force bombers attacked a Maputo suburb. 5 Mozambicans, including 2 women and 2 children, and 1 South African refugee, killed. Over 30 people are injured. Moving on to the 17th of October 1983, South African forces raided the ANC offices of the ANC in Maputo. The raid is internationally condemned. On the 5th of December, a bomb explodes at the Johannesburg office of the Department of Foreign Affairs, becoming the 42nd attack by ANC saboteurs in 1983. So it was a bloody year. Moving on to 1985, this is where the tensions increased even more. And we saw Thabo Mbeki announce on Radio Freedom that the ANC would continue to make the country ungovernable and would attack on all fronts in a united and coordinated political and military offensive. On the 14th of June, South African Defence Force Special Forces, together with members of the security branch, launched a cross-border raid on ANC targets in Gaborone, Botswana. 12 people are killed and 6 wounded in the operation, and among those killed are 8 South Africans, 2 Botswana nationals, a Lesotho and a Somali citizen. Then, on the 26th of June, 8 young activists are killed and 7 are injured in explosions involving booby-trapped hand grenades in Duduza, Guatema, and Tsakane, Transvaal. The zero-timed grenades have been provided by the Flak Pass operative, purporting to be an MK operative. The operation, codenamed 00, had been authorized by the Minister of Law and Order. Then on the 23rd of December, we saw the Sanlam shopping centre in Amazimtoti outside Durban bombed by MK cadre Andrew Sibusiso Zondo. 5 people are killed and more than 40 injured. So that really is just an outright act of terrorism, where an MK operative murdered civilians. This is not a military target. On the 14th of June, the following year, car bomb explosion outside Magoo's and Why Not bars on the Durban beachfront kills 3 people and injures 69. Robert McBride, who is an ANC operative, is later arrested and convicted for the bombs. So yet again, an act of terrorism targeting civilians. On the 8th of September, the ANC's diplomatic office in Stockholm, Sweden is bombed. However, no one is injured. So if we fast forward a little bit, we see how in the 1990s, the MK finally started to dial back its operations, obviously succumbing to pressure from the South African police and army. At the time, we see how the apartheid army is just militarily superior to the MK forces. So in an exclusive interview with the Herald, the ANC military commander, Joe Modise, stated the organization could consider the suspension of the armed struggle, but not laying down of arms in order to facilitate negotiations. On the 22nd of July, we saw that up to 40 members and officials of the ANC's military wing, MK, were recently captured while infiltrating South Africa from bases in exile. On the 7th of August, the ANC and South African government issued a joint declaration, the Pretoria Minute, at the conclusion of 15 hours of talks. The ANC announced that it would immediately suspend all armed actions, while the government undertook to consider lifting the state of emergency in Natal as early as possible and to continue reviewing the security legislation and its application in order to ensure free political activity. The report of the Joint Working Group on Political Offences was accepted by both parties. Both sides pledged to redouble efforts to reduce the level of violence in the country. Now, for those of you who have stuck around, thanks very much. I know that this was a very lengthy timeline, but it's important for us to go through it in order to establish the facts. We saw a trend whereby the MK party was unsuccessful in actually disarming or dismantling the South African apartheid government's army or police, either from outside the country or within its borders. Ultimately, what we can see here is that the apartheid government did a very good job of repelling the MK. We saw how they were able to conduct several raids and kill many MK members, both within South Africa and also abroad, whether they were in Angola or Mozambique and even in Europe, in places such as London, as well as Stockholm. And ultimately, whether we like it or not, the fact of the matter is that the apartheid government was militarily superior to the MK. So this idea that the MK is somehow the liberator of the party, or that the ANC was the liberator, is a complete and utter lie. The MK and the ANC did not liberate South Africa. And in order to further prove this point, we actually need to look at what else was going on in South Africa's military campaigns, specifically the border war. In order to fully understand the might of the SADF at the time, we need to remember that while they fought against MK, they were also fighting another external battle, specifically the border war, which took place in Southwest Africa, now Namibia, Zambia, and Angola further north. So I'm not going to go through the entire war, but I will give a quick summary. And what we need to understand is that if we look at the numbers, on the South African side, there were about 71,000 troops, as we can see in this block that I'm circling with my mouse. So over 30,000 SADF troops were active in Angola and Namibia. And then, of course, in Southwest Africa, we saw 22,000 SWATF troops and 83,000 SWAPO police. On the opposition side, we saw around 122,000 SWAPO militants. We saw that Cuba got involved as well with 40,000 of their own troops, and then Angola had 50,000 troops as well. But if we take a look at the casualties and losses, we see that on the South African side, only about 2,365 to 2,500 lives were lost. So if we were to say that the upper limit, 25,000 lives were lost. That means that of the 71,000 South African troops, only 3.5% succumbed to their injuries. If we look at the opposition, however, this death ratio is much higher. We see how 11,335 of the Namibian forces were killed. This is over 35% of the total SWAPO militants. If we look at the Cubans, between 2016 and 5,000 were killed. If we look at the upper limit again of 5,000, that is equal to over 12% of the total Cuban fighting force. And so South Africa seemed to get away with a lot fewer casualties in proportion to its enemies, despite being outnumbered on the battlefield. And this is largely due to superior technology and superior tactics. We also see South Africa's military superiority if we look at the reason why the war came to an end. So in 1988, the Tripartite Accord happened, where South Africa finally withdrew and the Namibians gained their independence. Now, of course, this could be viewed as a South African defeat, but we need to understand why South Africa took this decision. So as we take a look here, despite taking the necessary countermeasures on the battlefield, the South African government discerned it had reached the political limits of further escalation in Angola. The casualties sustained during the Quito Carnavale campaign had been sufficient to cause public alarm and provoke difficult questions about the tactical situation on the border and why South African soldiers were dying there. There was little reason to believe yet another bloody campaign would be successful in expelling the Soviets in Cuba from the region. On the contrary, as in the past, it could lead to an increase in the amount of Soviet weapons and Cuban troops. The conflict had also evolved from a low-intensity struggle against lightly armed insurgents into protracted battles between armies backed by all the paraphernalia of modern conventional warfare, with the accompanying rise in human and material costs. This contributed to a sense of war weariness and increased the growing skepticism and sensitivity in civilian circles towards the SADF's Angolan operations. And so this decision was one taken by P.W. Botha, the leader of South Africa at the time, and his apartheid regime. They understood that there was internal dissatisfaction within the white South African public. They were fast losing support for this war, and they understood that, politically speaking, it was not beneficial. And so South Africa's apartheid government at the time took an internal decision to bring the fighting to an end. And so if we take a look at the internal pressure as well as the external pressure, one thing is abundantly clear. The South African schooling system has lied to the public. The ANC and Umkhonto we Sizwe did not liberate South Africa from apartheid. They did not do it. They were unable to defeat the apartheid government militarily and politically. And at the end of the day, yes, they did have certain contributions that they made. I do not deny that. But ultimately, it was the external pressure that forced the apartheid government to capitulate. The arms embargo, as well as trade embargo, did put significant pressure on South Africa's supply lines. And we see that these kinds of costly military defeats did create weariness within the public, as well as a lot of internal public dissatisfaction, including amongst those who did support apartheid. Ultimately, it was this combination of things that got South Africa, specifically the apartheid regime, to finally change course. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you found it informative, please remember to subscribe to the channel for more content. Also, for additional perks, consider becoming a Power Club member by clicking the join button below. Until next time, I'm Matthew Cohen, and this is the Power Pod.